Welcome everybody around the world. This will be a nice quick video, and a welcome to all my subscribers. I made a number of videos like this before, but I end up taking them down because they end up being too long, like an hour. I only have about 15-20 minutes to make this one in, so I'm going to try as hard as I can to make it fit that time frame. And it'll be better for others to watch, and for if Tovia is going to watch it, for him to watch it. So anyways, in 15 minutes I'm going to prove to Tovia Singer himself and to everybody else watching that his and Judaism's modern interpretation on Isaiah 53 is incorrect. I will conclusively, utterly prove my stance here, and I will prove that it is not Israel who is the my servant subject in Isaiah 53 in that place. I will prove that it is Messiah. I will prove this using Isaiah 53, using all the chapters of Isaiah, and I will prove it using the opinions of the greatest rabbis that ever walked the face of the earth. Nobody, not not Tovia Singer, nobody can come back from this and say that I'm wrong, anything like that there. Simply, there's no coming back from this. You'll have to concede that I am correct. Okay, so the first problem comes with the following, okay? Judaism and Rabbi Tovia Singer, they all say the same thing. They say that Isaiah 53 is about Israel as the suffering servant, not Messiah. They want us to believe that there are two subjects in this discussion in Isaiah 53. It's the nations and the Messiah. Okay, now long story short, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go look up the term my servant. Okay, and I'm going to read every occurrence in the book of Isaiah, all chapters. Okay, because Tovia and Judaism want us to believe that no, when it says my servant in Isaiah 53, it's exclusively, it's only talking about Israel. It could be nobody else, they say. So anyways, what we find is that the term my servant occurs 16 times in Isaiah. I think 3 of these are plural. Okay, so 16 in total, 19, but 16. Okay, I don't have time to read through every one. I'll be here past 20 minutes. So in Isaiah 20 verse 3, it says my servant Isaiah. Okay, in Isaiah 22 verse 20 it says my servant Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. In Isaiah 37:35 it says David, my servant. In Isaiah 41:8 it says my servant Jacob. In Isaiah 41:9 I do believe this is talking about Israel as the servant. In Isaiah 42 it's talking about the Messiah. This is commonly accepted by most in Judaism, maybe not all, but okay, so that's another one. Next we have Isaiah 42:19, who is blind but my servant? Let's just leave that one out for now. I've already done this a million times. I know that I'm right. Isaiah 43:10, ye are my witnesses and my servant who I have chosen. Fine, let's give that one to Israel. So far out of like 6 or 7, we've got 2 for Israel, and all the other occurrences of my servant are about other subjects. Isaiah 44:1, it says, O Jacob, my servant, and Israel, whom I have fixed on. You could say that's a half point to Israel if you want to argue. But going on, then we see Isaiah 44:2, my servant Jacob and Jeshurun. Okay, in Isaiah 44:21, O Jacob and Israel, for my servant thou art. Fine, let's give a point to Israel there and to Jacob there. So we've got about 4 so far that are about Israel. 2 definitely, 2 like half points to Israel basically. Isaiah 45:4, for the sake of my servant Jacob and of Israel my chosen. Okay. Isaiah 49:3, say it to me, my servant thou art, O Israel. Fine, that's a definite point for Israel. Okay, Isaiah 52, it says, lo, my servant does act wisely. That one's up for question. I could still prove my point at the end of this, despite that one. Then Isaiah 53, that's where we're at. That's one that's in question here, so I'll get to that by reading the text. And that is it for my servant. So out of all those occurrences of the term my servant, in all the chapters of Isaiah, you have 16 occurrences, okay, 15 or 16, whatever. Some of them are plural. How many plurals are there? Let me go count so I can be 1, 2, 3, 4 more accurate. So there's 15 occurrences of my servant, and only 4, was it 5 at the most, definitely can be attributed to Israel. You know what I mean? So it's like, I like to analyze it like this. if you have a basket of fruit, all different types of fruit, okay? The one you want the answer to be, just say, is the apple. No, let's say it's the cherries, okay? Because people are cherry picking when they do this. So you have a basket of all different fruit: banana, apple, pear, plum, orange, you know what I mean? And a cherry. Okay, you want to pick out the cherry and say, hey, I got the cherry. It's what I wanted it to be. It's Israel, okay? But Israel is one of the options. This is like mathematics, okay? Each of the fruit is a different option. So the cherry would be Israel. The apple could be David. The orange might be Eliakim. The banana might be Isaiah. You see what I mean? So the reality, mathematically, probability-wise, is when you look in the basket and you're going to pick one of these fruit out, you have like 7 choices. You see my point? You have Isaiah, Eliakim, David, Jacob, Israel, okay, Messiah. So you have 6 different fruit. Only one of them is Israel. So when you're getting to Isaiah 53, you cannot just reach in and cherry pick the cherry out and say, oh, but this is definitely about Israel. You have to look at the context and actually prove, because going by the chapters of Isaiah, you have 6 different options. You see my point? So you can't just claim, oh, well, because from another chapter in Isaiah it's talking about Israel. You're pulling the wool over people's eyes. Isaiah 53 could be about David. It could be about Isaiah. It could be about Eliakim. Why are you just going to cherry pick Israel? You have to look at the context. What is Isaiah 53 saying? What are the words there? Now let's go look at it together. I've done this a million times. It's so clear as day. There's so many reasons it is not Israel from the text. It's just mind-blowing. Okay, so let's start off. In verse 2 it says, yea. I know what I'll do to save time is, let's just pretend that Tovia Singer and Judaism is modern Jewish, that the opinion of modern Judaism's interpretation of this is correct, and that it's Israel. So if they're so correct, what I should be able to do is insert the term Israel whenever that subject is brought up. Okay, whether it says he or my servant, I should be able to insert the term Israel. When we read it, it should flow, it should be truth. You see what I mean? There should be no problems or contradictions. So it says in verse 2, yea, Israel cometh up as a tender plant before him, God, and as a root out of a dry land. He, Israel, has no form nor honor when we observe him, nor appearance when we desire him. First problem. If that is Israel, then that utterly contradicts the Torah and the Tanakh, where it says that God beautifies himself in Israel. God doesn't choose something with no form or honor. He chooses something to beautify himself, like he told us. And if any Gentile was to come out and say that Israel has no form or honor, they'd be anti-Semitic. So why are we to believe that this is about Israel? It's ridiculous. But this is a minor point. That's the tip of the iceberg. That's meaningless compared to the rest, right? So, going on, verse 3, Israel is despised and left of men, a man of pains and acquainted with sickness, and as one hiding the face from us, he is despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely our sicknesses Israel has borne. So what the rabbis want us to believe is that our represents the nations. They're portraying, like I said, 2 subjects, Israel and the nations. Okay, so the nations are talking about Israel, right? So it says, the nations are saying, surely our sicknesses Israel has borne, and our nation's pains Israel has carried them. And we, the nations, we've esteemed Israel plagued, smitten of God, and afflicted. First problem here, this cannot be Israel, because like Rabbi Tovia Singer and all the other rabbis, and like all Judaism says nowadays, you cannot atone for the sins of another. Your own iniquity is on your own head. Ezekiel 18, how many videos do they have on that? But yet you want to hypocritically turn around and say that, oh no, Israel took on the sins of others. They took on the sicknesses. The joke is, the hypocrisy is, Tovia Singer and all the other rabbis say that, oh, it's impossible for Jesus to be Messiah. It's impossible that Isaiah 53 is about Messiah, because no man can take on the sin and the suffering for another person. But yet in the very same breath, with the very same mouth that they say, that they used to say that, they turn around and claim that, no, Israel did. Israel's not a person. It is a land and a nation of peoples. Peoples are human, the last time I checked, and if no human can take on the sin and suffering of another human, then why in the world can a nation of humans take on the sin and suffering of other nations? It's ludicrous. It's hypocrisy. Okay? You can't atone for the nations? Give me a break. It goes against your own theology. All right, so that's verse 4. Verse 5, and he, Israel, is pierced for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace is on him, and by his bruise there is healing to us. So you want us, again, in the same breath, to believe that Israel takes the beatings for the nations. Really? You want us to believe that? Same issue that I just talked about from verse 4. Hypocrisy. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Now in verse 6 it helps prove that they are wrong about who is speaking and who is what, the subjects. In verse 6 it says, all of us like sheep have wandered. This is talking about Israel. This is talking about Israel. God does not talk about the nations of Gentiles as sheep of his that have wandered. He talks about Israel like that. So in verse 6, it definitely is saying all of us, Israel, like sheep have wandered. However, if we're to believe what the rabbis have said, they're presenting that the us here is the nations. Because so far in Isaiah 53, we have a conversation between two subjects. The rabbis want us to believe it is between the nations, talking about Israel. However, the reality is, we are blatantly shown here in verse 6 that no, it's actually talking about Messiah and Israel. Period. Okay? In verse 6 says, all of us like sheep. That's definitely Israel. Okay? Have wandered. Each to his own way we have turned, and God has caused to meet on him. Who him? Israel? So it's a double Israel. Israel's both subjects in this here. Because, I mean, even the rabbis, I'm pointing out something, right? The rabbis would obviously agree and say the us is obviously Israel here. Yes, you're correct. It's not the nations here. This is because the conversation dialogue has switched. That's what they would claim. But the problem is, all of us, if I'm going to read it like how the rabbis want us to read it, all of us, Israel, like sheep have wandered, each to his own way we have turned, and God has caused to meet on Israel the punishment of us, Israel, all. That's a double subject. You can't have that. It's ridiculous. You're trying to have your cake and eat it too. You know why you're wrong? Because it's not about Israel. It's about, and it's not about the nations talking about Israel. It's about Messiah and Israel. Okay? Going on verse 7. It has been exacted, and he is answered, and Israel has answered, and Israel openeth not his mouth. As a lamb to the slaughter, Israel is brought. When did that happen? When in history did that happen? And as a sheep before its shearers is dumb, and he, Israel, openeth not his mouth. When in history was Israel led to the slaughter and they didn't open their mouth? You tell me. Never happened. You tell me. It never happened, okay? Verse 8, by restraint and by judgment Israel has been taken, and of his generation who does meditate? That he, Israel, has been cut off from the land of the living. By the transgression of my people he is plagued. Again, we have a double subject here. Bam! You can't have your cake and eat it too. It's talking about Messiah and Israel, not Israel. That Israel has been cut off from the land of the living. By the transgression of my Israel, Israel is plagued. But I thought the rabbi said that, the nations, that Israel is taking on the plagues for the nations, but now it's a double Israel. You see what I mean? They don't know what they're talking about. It's a bunch of tongue-twisted hypocrisy. Okay, it's on a Messiah and Israel. Okay, by strain and by judgment, Messiah has been taken, and of his generation who does meditate? That he, Messiah, has been cut off from the land of the living. By the transgression of my people Israel, Messiah is plagued. That is how it is to be interpreted, logically. Okay, and furthermore, since when was Israel cut off from the land of the living? Since when? It never happened. Never. And in verse 9, and it appointeth with the wicked his grave. When was Israel buried? And if any Gentile was to say that Israel is buried with the wicked, they'd be anti-Semite. But that's what the rabbis want us to believe here. And with the rich are his high places, because he, Israel, has done no violence, nor is deceit in his mouth. Really? So you also want us to believe that Israel has done no violence. How about where Moses was commanded to go, forwarded the command from God to everybody saying, go and kill every living thing in these lands. Every living thing. Have no pity on the fruit of the womb and all of that. And you want us to believe in the same breath Israel's done no violence? Don't even try to sell me that bunch of nonsense. Okay? Nor is deceit in his mouth. Really? How about when Solomon erected 800 different idols? How about when all the different Jewish kings erected idols in the temple and told people to worship trees and Asherah and all this and that there, in the Baalim? No deceit was in their mouth? They spoke truth when that transpired? Give me a break. Okay, and in verse 10, and God is delighted to bruise him. Who? Israel? God delights in bruising Israel? Really? It's kind of twisted. He has made him sick. If his soul does make an offering for guilt, he, Israel, seeth seed. He prolongeth days. Well, many times Israel did make offerings for guilt, but they still saw seed. That's proof it's not talking about Israel. It's talking about Messiah. What it's saying is that if Messiah sinned, if he wasn't righteous as he was supposed to be, but actually sinned, he would have to make an offering, as per law. And if he did do this, obviously he had failed to be utterly righteous, and in such a case, since he's given up the higher office, he's therefore got the mortal office to fulfill, which means a long mortal life, and you're going to have children. So if Messiah could stay righteous and not sin and be the good example for mankind from God, then he would fulfill his mission. If he failed his mission, he's still better than most people, so you'll have a long life, Messiah, and you'll have children. But thankfully, Messiah didn't sin. He did pass all the tests. He was righteous up until the end. So he didn't have to make an offering for guilt. But you see, Judaism doesn't want to point out the word if there. It says, if his soul does make an offering for guilt, he sees seed. What the rabbis in Judaism always try to throw in Christianity's face is that, oh, Jesus never had children. He couldn't be the Messiah because you believe Isaiah 53 is about Messiah, and Isaiah 53 says Messiah is going to have kids. No, it doesn't. It says, if Messiah sins, he will go on to have children. Learn to read. Okay? Now in verse 11, of the labor of his soul he seeth, he is satisfied. Through his knowledge give righteousness does the righteous one, my servant, to many, and their iniquities he does bear. So again, how does Israel, which is a nation of people and a land of dirt, how is dirt or a nation of humans going to bear iniquities of other humans when Judaism explicitly teaches you can't do that? You tell me, right? You can't have your cake and eat it too. All right? And it says, does the righteous one, my servant. So you want it to also be the whole nation of peoples is now one? The righteous one? God says the righteous one. He didn't say my righteous peoples. He says the righteous one, my servant. Which could be David or Jacob or Eliakim or Isaiah or Messiah. Just like all the other chapters of Isaiah lay out. Okay? Final verse. Therefore I give a portion to him among the many, and with his mighty... Really? So God gave Israel a portion among the many nations. Really? I thought God placed Israel at the top. You know what I mean? But according to the rabbis, nah, God just gave Israel a place amongst the nations. You know what I mean? And with the mighty he apportioned his spoil, because that he exposed to death his soul. So this is just confirmation, because I've heard some rabbis in Judaism sometimes claims, oh, but you know, that earlier verse that I read, it doesn't mean that Israel actually died. Well, no, it really does, because it just says that he exposed to death his soul. So don't try to twist this one too, okay? With transgressors he was numbered, as was Jesus, right? But when did any of these things in this whole chapter here happen with Israel? In the final verse, and he, Israel, the sin of many is born, and for transgressors he intercedeth. Give me a break. Does not apply to Israel. Isaiah 53 is not about Israel. And all the other occurrences of my servant show you have a 1 in 6 probability of it being Israel. So you look at the context, like I just did, it's not Israel. Okay? So in my final few minutes, I'm going to go look up, well, I've already got it here, go read the most prominent rabbis in all of human history, and what did they have to say on Isaiah 53. Let's fly through these. I've got a lot of them. Rambam, okay? A disciple of Hillel, the Talmud, okay? Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the Zohar, Nachmanides, Midrash Rabbah. Okay, I've got a lot of stuff here, okay? And some later rabbis, some of the best rabbis from the medieval ages. I'll go through all this right now. Rambam, Maimonides said, what is to be the manner of Messiah's advent, and where will be the place of his appearance? And Isaiah speaks similarly of the time when he will appear, without his father or mother or family being known. He came up as a sucker before him, and as a root out of the dry earth. But the unique phenomenon attending his manifestation is that all the kings of the earth will be thrown into terror at the fame of him. Their kingdoms will be in consternation, and they themselves will be devising whether to oppose him with arms or to adopt some different course, confessing in fact their inability to contend with him or ignore his presence, and so confounded at the wonders which they will see him work, that they will lay their hands upon their mouth, in the words of Isaiah when describing the manner in which the kings will hearken to him. At him kings will shut their mouth, for that which had not been told them they have seen, and that which they had not heard they have perceived. So clearly, the Rambam, greatest rabbi ever, as most Jews would claim, believed it was about Messiah. Okay? In the Aramaic translation of Isaiah 53, ascribed to Rabbi Jonathan ben Uziel, a disciple of Hillel, begins with the simple following statement, behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper, he shall be high and increase and be exceedingly strong, as the house of Israel looked to him through many days, because their countenance was darkened among the peoples, and their complexion beyond the sons of men. From Targum Jonathan on Isaiah 53. Okay, in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 98b, the Messiah, what is his name? The rabbis say the leprous one. Those of the house of the rabbis say the sick one. As it is said, surely he has borne our sicknesses. There's actually two occurrences in the Talmud. That's just one. And there's a third one which disputes that, but that's the nature of the Talmud. In the Mysteries of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, we find an Armalaus to join battle with Messiah, the son of Ephraim, in the east gate. And Messiah, the son of Ephraim, will die there, and Israel will mourn for him. And afterwards the Holy One will reveal to them the Messiah, the son of David, whom Israel will desire to stone, saying, Thou speakest falsely. Already is the Messiah slain, and there is none other Messiah to stand up after him. And so they will despise him, as it is written, despised and forlorn of men. But he will turn and hide himself from them, according to the words, like one hiding his face from us. And the Zohar. There is in the Garden of Eden a palace named the Palace of the Sons of Sickness. This palace the Messiah enters, and he summons every pain and every chastisement of Israel. All of these come and rest upon him. And had he not thus lightened them upon himself, there had been no man able to bear Israel's chastisements for the transgressions of the law, as it is written, Surely our sicknesses he has carried. Nachmanides, one of the greatest rabbis ever. The right view respecting this parasha, he says, is to suppose that by the phrase, my servant, the whole of Israel is meant. That's what the rabbis of today say. As a different opinion, however, is adopted by the Midrash, which refers it to the Messiah. It is necessary for us to explain it in conformity with the view there maintained. The prophet says, the Messiah, the son of David, of whom the text speaks, will never be conquered or perish by the hands of his enemies. And in fact, the text teaches this quite clearly. So what he's saying is that, no, those other opinions are wrong. Isaiah 53 is clearly about Messiah, and that Messiah would die. And he goes on saying, and by his stripes, Messiah's stripes, we were healed, because the stripes by which he is vexed and distressed will heal us. God will pardon us for his righteousness, and we shall be healed both from our own transgressions and from the iniquities of our fathers. In the Midrash Rabbah, in the explanation of Ruth 2:14, it says, he is speaking of King Messiah. Come hither, draw near to the throne, and dip thy morsel in the vinegar, refers to the chastisements of Messiah. As it is said, but he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. Next, in the Midrash Tanuma, Parashat Toldot, it says, Who art thou, O great mountain? This refers to the King Messiah. And why does he call him the great mountain? Because he's greater than the patriarchs, as it is said, My servant shall be high and lifted up and lofty exceedingly. He will be higher than Abraham, who said, I will raise my hand unto the Lord. Lifted up even above Moses, to whom it is said, Lifted up unto thy bosom. Loftier than the ministering angels, of whom it is written, Their wheels were lofty and terrible. And out of whom does he come forth? Out of David. From the Alkut, it says, Who art thou, O great mountain? This refers to the king, same as the last one. From the Alkut, we also have, I have drawn him out of the chastisements. The chastisements are divided into three parts, one for David and the fathers, one for our own generation, and one for the King Messiah. And this is that which is written, he was wounded for our transgressions. Rabbi Elijah Davidus from the 16th century said that since the Messiah bears our iniquities, which produce the effect of his being bruised, it follows that whoso will not admit that the Messiah thus suffers for our iniquities must endure and suffer them for himself. Rabbi Moshe Cohen Ibn Crispin from the 15th century says, this passage, Isaiah 53, the commentators explain, speaks of the captivity of Israel. That's when the opinion changed. Although the singular number is used in it throughout, like I pointed out, others have supposed it to mean the just in this present world, like Tovia Singh, and others argue, saying it's the righteous remnant, who are crushed and oppressed now. But these too, for the same reason, by altering the number, distort the verses from their natural meaning, the rabbi goes on to say. And then it seemed to me that having forsaken the knowledge of our teachers and inclined after the stubbornness of our own hearts and of our own opinion, talking of the other rabbis, I am pleased to interpret it in accordance with the teachings of our rabbis, that it is of the King Messiah. So he's saying people who say it's about Israel, they've forsaken the knowledge of the teachers and gone after the stubbornness of their own heart, thinking that the servant was Israel. But he says, in accordance with the teaching of our rabbis, it is of the King Messiah. That's the 16th century. So all the way up into the 16th century, they all believed it was about Messiah. Rabbi Moshe al-Sheikh, the rabbi of Safed in the 16th century, also points out, I may remark then that our rabbis, with one voice, accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet in Isaiah 53 is speaking of the King Messiah. And there's many more, but I don't have time to read them all. So the greatest Jewish minds and rabbis in history say firmly it is Messiah. All the occurrences of the term my servant show you got a 1 in 6 chance only of it being Israel. You also have a 1 in 6 chance of it being David or Jacob or Isaiah or Eliakim or Messiah. When you look at the context of Isaiah 53 and you go through the things that are actually said about it, you see they don't apply to Israel because none of those things happened to Israel. It's ludicrous. But those things could happen to a person, but they didn't happen to Israel. So it's obviously the Messiah. The reason why Judaism is so afraid to admit what their ancestors used to believe is because then they would have to accept that Messiah would suffer and die. And once they accept that Messiah suffered and died, then they have to re-examine Jesus with 2,000 years of guilt and shame. So there you go. God bless you all.